family and to the Kalamazoo family, I want to say happy Juneteenth. It is wonderful for us to gather here for this celebration. When the African people in Texas first heard of the freedom, we were only about 4.5 million Africans in this country, and today we are over 40 million. I come to you to talk about the theme that we have this day. And that theme is the spirit of freedom. And when I first saw the theme, I thought of how appropriate such a theme is for Juneteenth celebration. The reason it is so appropriate is because it has been the quest of African people in this country from the very beginning. When Abe Lincoln, President Lincoln, in September of 1862, declared that by January the 1st, 1863, all Africans who were in states that were in rebellion against the United States government, all those Africans would be free. This was later called the Emancipation, or was called the Emancipation Proclamation. But no Africans were free in January 1, 1863. And we know that. And sometimes we say 1863, Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, nobody was freed in January of 1863. The reason being, of course, that Lincoln's proclamation was really directed toward those states who had held Africans in bondage and who were holding Africans in bondage. And he said, if you're going to be in rebellion against the United States government, by January the 1st, 1863, all the black people in your state, all of them are free. Well, of course, you think people in Georgia or in Alabama decided to let us go in January 1st, 1863? No, war wasn't over. We were free after April the 9th, 1865. What was that? That was when the Civil War ended and General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant. That was the end of slavery. And then, of course, the passage of the 13th Amendment to really ratify that action, that we would be free. And then, of course, subsequently, the 14th Amendment giving citizenship to the African people in this country. And then the 15th Amendment giving actually the right to vote only to black men. So this was the progression, you see, of this notion of freedom. But the black people in Texas, even though the Civil War had ended in April, the black people in Texas did not get the word until June 19th. So that's why we celebrate Juneteenth. That's what we called it that time, Juneteenth. And they got the word after, they didn't have internet back in those days. They just had, you on a horseback. And you come from Washington, you tell all the black people along the way, you're free now. The war is over, you're free. When they finally got to East Texas and told the black people they were free, then the black people began to have festivals and celebrations. This is how we get Juneteenth, you see. But the interesting thing for me is this notion of freedom. Because freedom is the gift of African people to this country. If you go back and you read the history of the American nation, one of the things that becomes clear very early on is that black people were the ones who talked about freedom. This was not something the Europeans talked about. That was not in their vocabulary. In fact, The Declaration of Independence doesn't talk about freedom. It's not in the vocabulary of the language coming out of the Declaration of Independence, and the only way it's in the Constitution is in reference to speech and to no restrictions on religion. Word's not even mentioned. Freedom. Because white people were concerned about liberty. And there's a slight difference. The origins are a little different. The notion of liberty had to do a lot with property. It had a lot to do with the origins of that notion, not just in the libertas or the liberté, but in the notion that where you had unoccupied territory or property, people could claim that as a liberty. This is a liberty, this is a space, this is a free space. And if the king in Europe did not control that space, then that was a liberty. And so part of what the whites in America saw when they looked at this notion of Britain controlling America was that Britain really wanted to restrict their liberty, their right for economic success, their right for control of their property and land. To fight for freedom means that you have to be in bondage. That's where the Africans contribute to the general philosophy of freedom. We gave America that notion because our struggle was never one where we argued that somehow the main thrust of what we were after was liberty. We said our main thrust is freedom. Freedom from oppression, freedom from bondage. We sang the songs of freedom. We raised our voices in prayer to the Almighty for freedom. And then, after 1865, we said, free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. See, this was what we had achieved. And no people that I can think of had ever come so far in such a short period of time against such incredible odds as Africans in this country. Do you know it was an incredible journey? 246 years of enslavement. And this journey, and I always have to say, because sometimes in the United States, we forget that, this was a big project, monstrous as it was, but it was a big, monstrous project that didn't just involve the United States. It involved all of the Americas. African people were brought from Africa and were enslaved from Canada all the way to Argentina. That's the magnitude. Can you imagine the magnitude of this? You probably, just think about it. Because sometimes we think of the 40 million Africans here, and we don't think of the 100 million Africans, for example, in Brazil. I just came from Brazil 3 weeks ago. They still fighting the struggle. They got their freedom in 1888. One of the last places where you get freedom from slavery was Brazil. 1888. We got ours in 1865. But they had even been enslaved 100 years before us. It was an incredible journey in Brazil. I went there to celebrate the memorial of the great genius, Abdias do Nascimento, 97 years old. The Martin Luther King, the Malcolm X, the Marcus Garvey of Brazil passed away And when he was 93 years old, he came to my 65th birthday. So I decided that I had no other place to be 3 weeks ago but in Rio, to pour libations and to sing songs with the people, to see them pour these libations and to give my blessings for the great life of this man. But I was really not shocked, but stunned. This was, I've been to Brazil 5 times. And a young man named Tulio, who is actually a prodigy of mine, came to me and he said, Molefi, he said, I was just stopped by the police this morning. We were eating breakfast in Rio. Actually, I had been was staying in Copacabana, and we went to have breakfast at a Peruvian restaurant. And he said to me, he said, I was just stopped by the police because I have a white friend. And we were driving in his car, and the police stopped the car. This is in Rio. This brother is from Sao Paulo. In Rio, stopped the car and asked the white man, "Are you safe?" This is what is 2011? In a country that's predominantly black, they are still fighting this struggle. You see, it's being spoke everywhere. In Mexico, there are over 200 villages, towns, black villages of Afro-Mexicans. And the Mexican government has been trying to wipe them out through this whole notion, somehow, of saying, well, they really are not Africans. Because here, we just own one race. And that's not true. That's not even true for the natives in Mexico, the Indian population. The Native Americans in Mexico, they try to wipe out their population. The whole thing is part of the struggle. That's why I say the African Americans have come so far in this country. Because we have resisted oppression. We have always resisted it. We have confronted it every time. And when I look at these struggles, I ask myself, if a people so gifted, so talented, so enthusiastic about freedom, if this people had had the proper education about themselves, if we had had the proper education about ourselves, we would be much farther along the way. Even with all that we've done, we still don't have proper education. You have to recall that if we were the people that our ancestors wanted us to be, those who fought during the period of slavery, I mean people like Henry Box Brown. You may have heard of Henry Box Brown, you may not have heard of him, but Henry Box Brown shipped himself from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia for freedom in the 1850s. This was his ingenuity, his ability to figure out, well, they're shipping boxes to the north. All I need to do then is to figure out how I can just ship myself in one of these boxes. He almost died because they turned the box upside down. He was, his feet were in the air and his head was down. For about an hour, he said. He writes about this in his memoirs. And you think of all the ways, this is just one of the ways that African people use their ingenuity to get out of slavery. We have come this far, and we have come this far with all kinds of obstacles in our way. If you think about it, and I think about it a lot because I've just written a book called The African American People, and I hope you look for it. It's actually on Amazon.com, has it up now, but it'll be out in a couple of months. The African American People, a global history. Because one of the other things that I wanted to do was to show the relationship of what African Americans have not just done here, but African Americans all over the world. settled in many parts of the world. I mean, we had at least 50 African writers living in Paris at one time. African American writers, you see. You have the leading commercial star on commercials in Japan, in Tokyo, was African American. In China, Aaron Besser is one of the leading photographers. I mean, in Germany, we have Ollie Harrington, the cartoonist for German newspapers. There are many African Americans everywhere in the world. And when I travel around the world, I meet them. And the interesting thing is that they are people who are not only carrying out their responsibilities in those countries that they have settled, but they remember their own history and their own culture. So this is it's an interesting thing to think that with all these obstacles, because after the Civil War, and I want to make this quick, after the Civil War, we met with the Ku Klux Klan. In 1868, we had perhaps the greatest year of African freedom in the country up until that time, 1868. And that's because you had already now the African people with this freedom, and people were voting. There were new constitutions in southern states, and if people had been in rebellion against the American government, then they couldn't vote. And so black people voted. And when black people voted, and they elected progressive people, progressive whites, as well as progressive blacks, they changed the very nature of the South in terms of what they would call the Reconstruction period. That's when we got public schools. Public schools, before that we didn't have public schools in America. Public schools came because black politicians demanded there had to be public schools. Otherwise, where were the black children going to go to school? We didn't have public highways. Black people said we don't need turnpikes everywhere. Every time you get ready to cross somebody's property, they say you have to pay. Black politicians changed that. It changed first in the South. Public highways, public schools, public hospitals. These were great contributions. And then what happened? In 1877, remember this history lesson. In 1877, the Union Army, which was the Army of the United States of America, that had occupied the southern states, decided in a negotiation with the southern politicians that they would leave the South, that there would no longer be American military people stationed in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. They would just go on back to Washington. And once those American soldiers went back to Washington, all hell broke loose on black people in the South. So, this is the development of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, developed. It's a vigilante organization. Black people who were elected to office were killed, their houses were burned down, black people who decided to vote were murdered, people were lynched for all kinds of reasons. And ultimately what you had, you need to know this, you had almost for 75 years, you had a reign of terror in the South. Now look at this. We got our freedom in 1865. But in 1965, they had to have another Voting Rights Act. 100 years later, why? What's going on? Because for all that time, after 1877, black people were denied the right to vote in the South. My father never voted in Georgia. My grandfather never voted in Georgia because they were denied the right And not only were they denied, if they were people who had jobs, if they tried to vote, they would lose their job. This was a terror. No, I'm a lover of the history of African Americans. I think no people have put up with such incredible brutality over such a long period of just brutal activities and come out of it. And I say a short period of time in terms of our success. Yeah, but in terms of our coming out of it, that's been quick and short. But it was a lot of brutality. It is not over. It still reigns. You know that Barack Obama has received many more death threats than any other president in history. It is not over. The attitudes are still part of the American fabric. And yet, out of that fabric, we have seen some successes. Rutherford B. Hayes was the president of the United States. And when Rutherford B. Hayes left office, he called a conference in Mohonk, New York. It's called the Mohonk Conference. If you're interested in it, you can look it up on Google. The Mohonk Conference was called to deal with the Negro problem. And the question was, what do we do? This was near the early part of the 20th century. What do we do with black people? And particularly, they were finishing up the 19th century, and in the 1890s, with all of the race riots and all of the lynchings of black people, the question was, well, how are we going to deal with this? And you know what they came up with? Two things. We're going to have to educate black people to serve, and we're going to have to give them the Christian religion. This is 1890s. This was the big move. We got to send more missionaries into the South, because what we are discovering, this is what they were saying, what we're discovering, there are a lot of black people who are superstitious. And I came from one of those superstitious families. It was a long time before my mother took the rabbit foot that she had tied around my neck, off of my neck. I came from that. That's my family. That's my history. That's my culture. So I know that. So I know that part of what they felt about us, and particularly those of us who grew up as Geechee in the South, was that somehow we got to get that out of them. Because the whole idea of how to make black people acceptable to white people. This has been the movement. How do you do that? How do you take that culture, that Africanness that's in black people, and how do you take it out of them so they'll be okay? You got to educate them, or school them, I call it. After Nwala Shuja, that's what he says. He says, not education, it's schooling. Not teaching people to be rational or critical. Not teaching them to think, but teaching them basically, or rather schooling them in a way that they will be able to be servants forever. No, we cannot do that. We know how to educate our people and our children. To educate black children, though, you gotta love them. You can't be a good teacher if you don't love the children in front of you. If you don't see these children in front of you as a replacement of you, or if you don't see these children like you would see your own child. If you want, how do you educate your own children? That's how you must educate these children. And and black people know that, black educators know it. We've worked on this. Ujima knows this. This is the whole idea behind this process of intervention. We understand this. And it is this intervention that makes a difference. Most black children, particularly, I've seen it with male children, most male children, black male children, do not fail. even if they get an F. You know, do people fail them? Yeah. But do they fail? No. To fail, you have to try. They don't even try. And why is it they don't try? They don't try because they're smart enough sometimes to realize things that we don't realize. That the information that they're getting, the things that they're being told, they know that it's dangerous and poisonous. So part of it, and I talked to Herbert Cole about this, he's an educator, venerable educator. He says, Molefi, black children are rarely given the chance to express themselves with a degree of freedom. And we rarely give our children the opportunity to be who they are. You know, you saw the dancing and you heard the drumming. Why don't they have that in every school? Why don't we have drum ensembles at schools? This is a culture. This is what children would immediately understand. But the society is against that. If you go around talking, you know, I can see the reactionaries right away saying something like, boy, Asante wants to have drums in every school. Yeah, I do. Just like we got glee clubs. I want to see drums in every school. Because part of what it is not appreciating African culture. And our children don't have problems with self-esteem. Our children have problems with cultural esteem. They don't like being African sometimes. And that is a dangerous thing. Most children like who they are in terms of their culture. They may not like themselves individually. Because I've read research that says, for example, that black adolescent girls like themselves more than white adolescent girls. I've read research that says that Asian children have lower self-esteem than black children. But you know what Asian children have and what white children have? They love their culture. African children don't. Why is that? Education. So it's a profound disconnect here. And yet I see, and I've seen for 40 years of teaching, how African American children respond to their own history and culture. That's what I've been doing for 40 years. So I know that it works. I've seen it work. It worked with my own children. So I know it works. But how do you get a system that is designed to school black children to really want to educate black children? To really ask the people who know, to really use the techniques that we know work? That's what we have to do. I just want to say a few more words. I want to say something also about I want to say a little bit about some political stuff, because I need to say this. I just think that we need to teach people to be critical and to have critical judgment. I've been speaking in the last 2 months on issues in Africa, particularly Libya and Ivory Coast and now Sudan. And I just want y'all to know that I'm against the war on Africa. I am totally against the war on Africa. It's a misguided war. The war on Libya is a misguided war. The attempt to divide Libya into like North Korea and South Korea is wrong. It's bad. The Benghazi faction and the Tripoli faction. You need to know this, that the situation in Egypt was different from the situation in Libya. And I'm on my way to Egypt in a few weeks. The thing about Libya was that, in Egypt, they had the demonstrations, the peaceful demonstrations in Cairo. Hundreds of thousands of people came out. And then, of course, they toppled the government. And all of us applauded. That's good. That government needed to be toppled, we said. But in the situation in Libya, peaceful demonstrations were very soon hijacked by an armed group of thugs with a violent intent to overthrow the government in Tripoli violently. That was totally different from what had happened in Egypt. And so this group, this cadre of people in Libya who had guns and military arms fighting against their government were therefore confronted by the government with arms. And this is what Gaddafi did. He said, okay, you're going to rise up and arm rebellion against the country, just like the Civil War in America, then we have to fight you. See, our government is wrong in supporting a minority group of people in Libya to fight against the majority of the people. And we claim that we were fighting to protect the civilians of Libya, when in fact NATO has killed far more civilians than Gaddafi ever did. This, if we are rational and we read information and we study information, we will understand these things. Take the Ivory Coast. This is another one. We were wrong on the Ivory Coast situation. In Ivory Coast, the man who won the election according to the Constitutional Court of Ivory Coast was a man by the name of Gbagbo. The man that the West supported and our government supported and France supported was a man who had served the World Bank and his name, and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and his name is Ouattara. The Supreme Court of Ivory Coast said Gbagbo is the winner. The United States and France said no, Ouattara is the winner. We went against the Supreme Court of that country and propped up militarily a person who basically came in and usurped the power in Ivory Coast. There are reasons people say for this. One is that in the case of Gaddafi, two things. He was an independent African leader. His whole idea was that Africa should be free. He used the money, his oil money, to support African unity and also the African people. In Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, it was the same way. Gbagbo said, look, I believe that Africa should be independent, there should be sovereignty, that the Ivory Coast should not become again a colony of France. So, of course, Gbagbo had to go. Gaddafi, they're saying now, must go. I'm saying to you, as an African American, I look at this situation with great in horror. I mean, it's a horrendous situation. It is an assault on sovereign nations supported by our government, which is not correct. And take Sudan. Now, there's another issue. Now, Sudan is a country where I think it's legitimate for the United States to be involved in, but I don't see an involvement in Sudan. That's a country where just yesterday they bombed civilians. The government bombed civilians in Sudan, but we give Sudan a pass. You can't have this kind of contradiction in terms of the politics. And I think that our people, African American people, who struggle for freedom, who believe in freedom, who celebrate this Juneteenth, that we have to be more involved in raising these questions. And as much as we love Barack Obama, we must be critical of policies that are totally against the interests of humanity. And these issues in Africa will come back to haunt us in the United States of America, because we are taking the wrong side, just like we took the wrong side for so long when the American government supported the South African government. I want to say a couple more things and then I will be finished. Juneteenth is a celebration. And each one of us must try to make things better. each one of us must try to make our families better, to make our children better. Philip Emegwali, you may have heard of him. There's a lot of controversy around him, but one thing you can say is that Philip Emegwali is perhaps one of the most brilliant people we have talking about mathematics. I mean, I don't know whether you've heard of this man. Some people have called him the real father of the internet because he developed these supercomputers in 1989. He won an award for developing these computers and so forth. And he's a Nigerian, but he's an American citizen. But one of the things I heard him say, which I think is so remarkable, and he said that as a child, he would come home from school, and his father would look at his lessons, his homework, and see that the teacher had given him 5 problems to solve. And once he would solve those 5 problems, the father would give him 100 problems to solve. And you know what he said? He said, if you take a child and you give a child 100 problems to solve when they come home from school, every day you give them 100 problems to solve, you will make a mathematical genius. So he said, people look at me and ask, how did I come up with loving math and being able to do all these calculations? He said, it's the work that my parents gave me. You know, you have some schools that don't give children any homework. And you have parents who participate in it. They don't want their children to have any homework. They say it's too much. So part of the issue about freedom and the spirit of freedom and the spirit of enthusiasm and energy of the African people is that we must revamp the way we think about educating our young people. We must look at the impact not only of just the factual information, but the cultural information. And that's where Ujima comes in. It is that really underscores everything we do. We must live Mont, we must do Mont, we must be Mont. Hotel. And thank you very much.